Very good afternoon to you all. Apologies for the slight delay in starting this afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us on this Southend EPS Reach Out webinar. So I'm just going to start sharing my screen and we'll have a look at what we're thinking about today. So I'm Nicole Schnackenberg and I'm one of the EPs at Southend. Just see. Okay, lovely. Hope you can see that all right. So yes, warm welcome from sunny Southend-on-Sea today. We're going to be talking about attachment and the right brain. And I'm on maternity leave at the moment, actually. So when I'm thinking about this topic, I'm very much thinking about the 12-week-old, the delightful 12-week-old I have in my home and my heart at the moment. So I'll be talking a bit about Lawrence, I imagine, as we go along. And here, this picture, there's a few pictures like this. This photo really touches me. It's an image of a baby in utero, and there's an operation occurring, and actually the baby's reached out to grab hold of the surgeon's hand. And that for me epitomizes this idea that we're wired for connection and attachment even whilst we're growing in the womb. And in fact, we'll talk about the importance of the first 1,000 days, and that includes that whole time in utero. If you have any questions as we go along, or reflections or comments, if you could please use the Q&A button, I'd be delighted to come to those, possibly at the end. So what will we be thinking about in this short webinar? We'll be thinking about how and why the right hemisphere of the brain is central to the attachment relationship, for indeed it is, and how we can use this knowledge. So what do we do with it to build those nourishing, positive, affirming attachment relationships, both within the caregiving, the primary caregiving experience, but also when we're having second chance attachment relationships in places like schools, colleges, alternative provisions, and so on. We're wired for attachment throughout our lives. It isn't an infancy thing. And as you'll see there from the image, the left hemisphere of our brain is traditionally thought about as the logical, linear, sort of linguistic side of the brain, and then the right hemisphere of the brain related very much to the emotional and the social world, also to creativity and to musicality. And then we have in the middle the corpus callosum, dividing those two hemispheres and also enabling a communication between those two hemispheres. So let's begin with Daniel Stern. I love reading absolutely anything by Daniel Stern. I warmly recommend him. He's a professor of psychiatry and developmental psychology as well. And he talks about these early stages of development. So now we're thinking about once the baby is out of the womb, but we're thinking very much about those first 1,000 days. And what I want to say about those first 1,000 days is that they are a critical period. They're a critical period for brain growth. Another point in our life does our brain grow so dramatically or prolifically, key to the development of the social self and the emotional self. So at 6 weeks old, he talks about the world of feelings. It's the felt sense of the infant. Everything is through sensations, through the somatizations, through the sensations experienced in the body. At 4 months, around about, these are ballpark, babies and infants and human beings develop at different rates, of course, but this sense of the immediate social world, we see that beautiful social smile developing. So in my little Lawrence, who's now 12 weeks old, that social smile is there, and it's beautiful to see, smiling in response to me smiling or making silly noises and singing to him and things like that. At 12 months, around about, the world of mindscapes are beginning thinking about thinking or thoughts and verbal cognitions, and then 20 months really focus on the world of words and verbalizations. Again, this is very broad. So Daniel Stern talks about these developmental stages taking place in the interpersonal world of the infant. It happens between people. infants do not develop as singular beings. So a sense of self, the sense of self of the infant always includes another. So it's always a sense of a self with another. So from around birth until 2 months, there's this living in the emergent self, and with the focus very much on regulation. And again, the right hemisphere of the brain is key for regulation. And again, in those first 1,000 days, that's a critical period for acquiring those skills of emotional regulation that then take us through really the rest of our lives. Of course, we can continue to build on it, but they're rooted in those first 1,000 days. So it's the co-regulation initially with the primary caregiver. We need to co-regulate before we can self-regulate, to soothe, if you like, before we can self-soothe. And some developmental psychologists will say there's complete symbiosis at this stage. The body of the infant and the body of the mother or the father or the primary caregiver are one. The baby doesn't differentiate between, for example, the breast and the mother, or the bottle and the mother, or the touch of the hand and a separate human being. It's all one moment knitted together, an interpersonal moment of connectedness. And then by about the 2nd month, there's the boundaries and the sense of one's body is beginning to come alive. And again, I saw this with Lawrence. He suddenly noticed he had hands. Oh, looking at his hands, what are these? And then beginning to use eye gaze in a very different way. So between 2 to 3 months, there's an increasing myelination of the visual areas of the infant's occipital cortex. So the eyes are really developing at this point, and that's where eye gaze really changes. And again, I experienced this with Lawrence. So the focus of the infant's attention can shift and often become very interested in the pupils of the caregiver's eyes. It might not be sustained contact because it's a real emotional intensity. And I think sometimes mothers, fathers, primary caregivers worry, why is my baby looking off to the side? And we see that very often. And it can just be the intensity of that emotional experience, but there begins to be an interest in the pupils of the eyes and in that gaze. Interestingly, with breastfeeding, the breast is about 10 inches from the pupils of the eyes. So that's a really good distance for that level of myelination for the infant to connect with the primary caregiver's gaze. And, it doesn't have to be the breast, the bottle, whoever's feeding the baby, holding them about 10 inches away is optimal. So, interestingly, an infant will smile in response to enlarged pupils. So when the primary caregiver's pupils dilate, that can release a smile, and that releases caregiving behaviour. So there's this reciprocity happening, that's a difficult word to say, through the pupils of the eyes. And of course, it's happening beneath the level of conscious awareness. I'm not thinking to myself, I'm now going to dilate the pupils of my eyes, or I'm now going to smile in response to the dilation of the eyes of my baby or of my mother. Rather, this is happening within milliseconds. It really is this dance, if you like, happening with the eye gaze, very much connected to the right hemisphere of the brain. So we could think about, and we should, the pupils of the eyes as a very powerful communication device. And we could even go as far to say that the mother or father primary caregiver's face is the infant's biological and emotional mirror. So there's this reflection happening in the gaze to gaze, the face to face context. And it's not really just a biological mirror. Alan Shaw, again, highly recommend anything by Alan Shaw. He talks very much about attachment, the right brain, and the emergent emotional and social self of the infant. It's more precisely an amplifying mirror. And we're talking about upregulating and downregulating. So upregulating joy states through the face, through the expressions, through the pupils of the eyes, beneath the level of conscious awareness, and downregulating things like fear states. And psychoanalyst Alexandra Lemmer talks about the touch-gaze relationship. So in those early months, the relationship is very much built through touch and gaze. Of course, also through rhythm and prosody of voice and tone of voice, but touch and gaze are very, very primary and central to this. And again, this is a right brain to right brain connection, a right hemisphere to right hemisphere experience. So we couldn't talk about this, could we, without bringing in Donald Winnicott, who was writing before all the neuroscience research was coming into play. And it was, as you know, was Bowlby, and yet they seem to understand. And now we've got all this neuroscience to back us up, what we knew. So the main thing is a communication between the baby and the mother or primary caregiver in terms of the anatomy and physiology of live bodies. So the loving gaze is essential for this secure attachment, and it's used to communicate to and attune with emotional states. And as I said, the detection and processing of the smallest change in the human face, something like the dilation or the contraction of the pupils, occurs in such small milliseconds that it is very much beneath the level of conscious awareness, and it is very much a right hemisphere experience. Remember, when we talk about the right hemisphere, we're talking about the emotional side of the brain. So yes, so it's very much about being psychobiologically attuned. And it's important to note that the right cortex, the right hemisphere, matures far before the left. So the left hemisphere doesn't have a postnatal growth spurt until the second year. So we're talking again about those first 1,000 days that take us up to the end of the second year. So those first 1,000 days are days really focused on the right hemisphere of the brain, which is known to be specifically impacted by early social experiences. And we can even say up to the first 3 years of life that the right hemisphere is dominant. So because the infant's brain and the infant's nervous system is less developed than the primary caregivers, they will necessarily use the primary caregiver's nervous system and brain to develop their own. So it's almost like a downloading of the nervous system and the neuroscience of the primary caregiver with the infant. And the infant experiences this, as we said, as a symbiotic relationship initially, and then begins to enter into this social world that Daniel Stern talks about, where there's this sense of, okay, if I smile, you smile in return. There's an awareness there of that social attunement happening. So I like what Michael Franz Basch says about this. The language of the mother and infant consists of signals produced by the autonomic involuntary nervous systems in both parties. And this is where we come to all the research that looks at, for example, developmental trauma, and the fact that the biggest predictor of our attachment with our offspring is the attachment that the primary caregiver had with their own primary caregiver. So this is very much transgenerational. It doesn't mean that those patterns can't be altered, of course not, but it does mean that they have an impact. So I love this, that the infant and the mother, and the infant and the primary caregiver, the experiences of one where one and one make one and not two. And this is fascinating, that if we look at artwork and if we observe primary caregivers out and about, we look at photographs, we'll notice that infants are typically placed on the left side during soothing. And I have to mention here that as I mentioned at the beginning, I have a 12-week-old, dear Lawrence, and I've held him on my left side to such an extent that I've now pulled a muscle in my left ribs. And it's fascinating to me because that now means I have to hold him on my right for now until it heals. And it just isn't working out for us. I can't seem to soothe him in the same way. It doesn't feel so natural. Because on the left side, we've got the left eye and the left ear of the mother connecting to the baby. And of course, the left eye and the left ear are functioning through the right hemisphere of the brain. So when we've got the baby on the left, it's a right hemisphere to right hemisphere connection that we're having. And this has been found to be less common in men although not uncommon, and independent of handedness. So whether a person is left or right-handed, tends to be that particularly mothers soothe their babies on the left, enabling that right brain to right brain connection, that emotional brain to emotional brain connection, because this is not about cognitions. And any primary caregiver will tell you that it's connecting with the felt sense of that infant. It's very much linked to the emotion and intuition. So just before we go on to thinking about how can we use all of this understanding, both in our relationships within families and other relationships, but also in our work, if we're working with children, young people and families, I think it's important to mention this aspect of infant separation and individuation. So it was Winnicott that very much spoke about individuation in particular. So this talks about that separation of that symbiotic state that happens up until about 2 months. And it's the differentiation of the self from others. And this is facilitated by transitional objects, another thing that Donald Winnicott spoke about. It's that teddy, it's that little blankie, it's the thing that the child uses to soothe themselves in the absence of the primary caregiver, to then internalize that capacity to soothe without it. So there's the soothing, the co-regulation with the primary caregiver. There's the soothing through the object and some sort of regulation that happens through the object. And then there's no need of the object anymore because that's internalized and the infant can soothe themselves to an extent, of course. So this goes alongside the idea that the infant develops their sense of identity based on what they see mirrored back. So they internalize that as well. They internalize the capacity to self-soothe and internalize the gaze in the face of the other, if you like. And necessary to this process is internalization. And as I think I mentioned at the beginning, there are two aspects here: vitalization and soothing. We tend to talk a lot about soothing, particularly when we think about emotional development through the lifespan, and particularly when we think about when that goes awry. So when people are struggling with emotional regulation, and of course struggles with emotional regulation are absolutely at the heart of mental health struggles. We also need to think about vitalization, so amplifying that crescendo as well as the decrescendo. So through the tone of voice, through the eye gaze, through touch, we upregulate things like joy states and excitement, as well as being able to soothe things like pain and distress and fear. And in healthy development, the infant will internalize both, internalize the capacity to amplify their joy states. There's much to be enjoyed in life, so to take deep pleasure in that excitement and amplify it, but at the same time be able to soothe the self. And there again, this idea of that internal picture of the self in the gaze of the other. So just to really drive it home and to summarize in a way. So the orbital frontal cortex matures in the middle of the second year of the infant's life. And at this point, they've typically got around 15 words. So this adds to, as well as the fact that it's the right hemisphere of the brain that does the big growth spurt in the first couple of years, that the core of the self is non-verbal. Remember that linguistic is, okay, it's across the brain, but it's more connected with the left hemisphere and unconscious, and lies in the patterns of emotional regulation. Those patterns of emotional regulation, again, being a right hemisphere experience. So what we're saying is, the very core of who we are is not based in words and cognitions. And yet, so often when we're working with children, young people and families, we use a lot of words and cognitions to try and make sense of things and to try and support. And all of this evidence is very much suggesting that there's an invitation back into the feeling state, an invitation back into the right brain, an invitation back to emotion and to that social world. So it's important here to think, therefore, about transference and countertransference. And these are psychoanalytic terms, fancy ways just of saying that the infant and then later the child will transfer their felt sense, their experiences to their primary caregiver. And I know this with Lawrence. And when he's in pain, I feel pain. When he cries, I feel my tears rising up. And then the countertrans, so that's what he's giving to me, if you like, that felt sense. And then I am then feeling that in my body. That's the countertransference. So every transference prompts a countertransference. Of course, so Lawrence feels in pain, he transfers that to me. My countertransference is perhaps that I cry. I feel the pain with him. And again, this is communicated through the eye gaze, the minute facial expressions, posture, prosody of voice and rhythm as well. You know, the whole parent rocking and swaying, and this is all very much connected to that as well. So throughout our lives, we continue to respond at the sensory, motor, physiological level, because that's exactly where it went awry in terms of co-regulation. Again, we don't co-regulate through words. I talk to Lawrence all the time. I babble away to him all day long, but it's not the words that are interesting to him at the moment. It's the tone of my voice. It's the prosody of my voice. It's the rhythm. It's the pitch. Those are the things that are soothing him at this point and being internalized. So this is a massive rationale for not auto-regulating too rapidly. So very often when we're working with children and young people, we, as I said, maybe go into the words or the cognitions going into that left brain, rather than initially connecting right brain to right brain beneath the words, if you like. We're very much talking here about using our eye gaze, using rhythm, using the tone of our voice. And we're going to come on to think about that very shortly before we finish. In fact, now. So this is all very interesting. This idea that we have that the first 1,000 days is critical, that the emotional and social brain, the right hemisphere of the brain, has a growth spurt during this time, that felt sense of the self is very much based in that emotional and social experience. But what do we do with that? Why is it important? And how can we use this knowledge and understanding to help us? Well, firstly, it's for sure a case for early support, including in the prenatal period. So remember, those first 1,000 days include gestation and into the second year. So support for mothers and for those supporting them, the fathers, the other primary caregivers, when the baby is still in the womb. You know, supporting the emotional, psychological well-being of that person, and then into the first and the second year as well. Regulating our own nervous systems. So if our nervous systems are being communicated to infants and then later to children and indeed other adults through things like the dilation of the pupils of the eyes and minute facial expressions that we can't control consciously, then regulating our own nervous systems is going to support that process. So for example, if I know I'm very prone to sympathetically aroused states, I go very quickly into that fight, flight, freeze or fawn in particular situations. If I've got tools in my toolkit to calm myself and to calm my nervous system, that isn't going to be communicated in the same way to the other person. So for example, if I'm in a classroom working with a child, and I know that certain behaviours are going to set off my sympathetic arousal, and I have a breathing technique to soothe that, then the pupils of my eyes aren't going to, because pupils of eyes also dilate at that point as well. And then there's fear, there's a fear response being communicated. And in part, perhaps that's why often it will invite a smile from the infant, because they're trying to unconsciously, of course, connect and bring that fear state down. Then we're not going to get into that heightened state and into that unhelpful or less than helpful loop. You know, it's very difficult for a dysregulated adult to regulate a dysregulated child. So being informed by our own internal states, taking our felt sense of intuition seriously, listening, feeling into the felt sensations of our bodies. That is a right brain experience, and that's how the initial attachment in ideal situations would have occurred, through that felt sense of bodies. The use of eye gaze, tone of voice and touch, mindfully and sensitively, and not relying too heavily on language, because that would straight away take us into the left hemisphere of the brain. It doesn't mean it doesn't come, but if, for example, we are working with a child in a dysregulated state, we might simply start with a soft gaze, some simple words if we're using words, but in a very calm tone of voice. We might use some rhythm. We might have some gentle music, or something to soothe that child before we go into lots and lots of words. Supporting, encouraging and playing games and interactions which promote that gaze to gaze connection and right brain to right brain communication. So we might want to actually place the child that we're working with on our left. If we're soothing infants on our left as primary caregivers, then why not, when we're making those connections, to place them on our left, particularly for children that we know might have experienced developmental trauma or find it difficult to make those right brain to right brain connections, and to put them on our left will facilitate that process. Use of rhythm. This is also interesting to me. So with Lawrence, I will rock and bounce him in my rhythm, which is connected to my nervous system, I'm sure connected also to my heartbeat and all manner of other things. And I've noticed that when he goes to other people that bounce in a similar rhythm, he'll stay with them longer than people that perhaps bounce in a faster or slower rhythm. Then he'll become distressed and want to go back to mummy much quicker. So we can continue to use this rhythm. And even things like, the sound of the heartbeat. I have one of these owl things, that you hang on the bed for Lawrence, where it plays sounds of the womb and the sound of the heartbeat. No reason why we can't use some of those things with older children and young people as well. I recently heard about 2 teenagers who love to just lie on the bed listening to the whirling of the hairdryer. They find that soothing, and why not? And that probably goes back a very, very long way. So finding what helps in terms of sound and rhythm can be supportive. So this would include things like the use of poetry, music. Poetry has a certain cadence and rhythm, singing, including metaphor. So metaphor is very much that we find in poetry and creative writing and other places, is very much a right brain thing. Anything we can do to connect to the right brain, art, creativity, right brain. Let's get the paints out. Let's do the messy play, get the clay, play the music. These will all support that going into the right brain, the emotional brain, the social brain, which can facilitate other things. If we know we're going to be having a tricky conversation with a child or a young person, why not start with the right brain? Why not listen to some music and get the paints out first? Or even during that tricky conversation. As I said, so consider placing that child or young person on the left, and perhaps for those activities, but also during key attachment moments. And as we've mentioned, making that right brain to right brain connection before going into solutions. So lots of verbalizations. Let's first connect at the level of the felt sense, connect at the level of the emotions, connect to the level of the heart. And through all of this, let us remember rupture and repair. So this isn't to say that we're doing this perfectly 100% of the time. Developmental psychologists talk very much about this idea of the 30% being good enough. And good enough, as Donald Winnicott said, is good enough. So if we are making these attunements, if we're attuned in this way, right brain to right brain, around 30% of the time, we're doing a really good job, actually. And, the rest of the time is facilitating rupture and repair. When there are misattunements happening, then there's a bit of a rupture, but then that gives us a golden opportunity for the repair. So with the infant, to put them on our knee and stroke their hair if we're the primary caregiver, for example, or another adult that's able to do that. And then, and that's very much necessary, the rupture and the repair. It's perfection 100% of the time would bring its own difficulties and would also not support the process of the internalization of regulation, because that is also how we learn to regulate, through the misattunements and knowing that the whole world doesn't fall apart, and that we can both have that capacity with the other person during the repair, but also have that, find and eventually that capacity within ourselves. And then also, as we mentioned, to remember vitalization as well as the soothing. So yes, we can do a lot of thinking about how do we soothe, how do we support that emergence of the parasympathetic branch of the autonomic nervous system, that relaxing, down-regulating part, but also how do we stimulate the sympathetic, how do we amplify joy states. I think so often we can be afraid if we can't excite them too much, the children and the young people in particular, because they'll go spilling off into space and we'll never get them back. But that's where there's that trust as well. You know, we can vitalize and we can amplify, and then we can soothe. And that's the dance that happens. And I suggest we can very, very much in those cases be led by the child or the young person. So there's a few suggestions here for readings. I would very much suggest Anything by Alan Shaw and Anything by Daniel Stern, who both write about the interpersonal world of the infant, and Alan Shaw in particular writes about this experience of the right hemisphere of the brain. Also Sue Gerhardt, Why Love Matters. All of these books can be very supportive in our further understanding of this area. So I hope that's been helpful. I invite you now to pop any questions or reflections into the Q&A, both about any of the content, but also about this particular slide here, what this can mean. And if you've got ideas for what this can mean, you know, how can we connect right brain to right brain? How can we use this knowledge about the importance and the centrality of the right hemisphere of the brain in the emergence of the social and emotional self in our interactions and in our work? So I'm just going to stop my screen share now, and I can see that some things have popped up along in the chat, and I'm just going to have a look at the Q&A. The research predominantly references mother-child relationships. How does this apply to fathers too? Absolutely. And I think, again, this is an emerging field. So I think perhaps in the 60s and the 70s, a lot of the research and into the 80s was with mothers and infants. And I think we're a lot more open-minded now to understand that fathers and partners are primary caregivers too, and sometimes are the primary caregiver. So there is an emerging body of research there. And that was something that really struck me, actually, particularly during this COVID time. You know, I was very thankful that my husband was able to come, for example, to the scans for Lawrence, but had to go in through a back door because of COVID. And I know that we were fortunate because just before that time, fathers weren't allowed in to the scans, and they were missing out on fathers and partners because it was just one person. Missing out on that point. And even when I was then in the hospital labouring, there was this, unless there was a particular reason, this idea that until a certain point in the labour that the partner had to remain outside and then could come in, and with visitation afterwards and things like that. So it's so important to include, and when the health visitors come to visit us, where possible, to have the partners and the primary caregivers there. Hopefully the research as well will begin to reflect all of this. Someone here has said, isn't the holding of the baby on the left side related to the fact that the mother's heartbeat is of comfort to the baby? That's a lovely point, and I'm sure it is as well. And I often notice that Lawrence will fall asleep on my chest with his ear pressed up against his chest. And I imagine part of that is him being able to hear the heartbeat that indeed up until 12 weeks ago he was hearing from the inside out. So I'm sure it's the right brain to right brain connection, and possibly also the connection to the heartbeat. I don't know any research there. I'm sure there is some, and it's a lovely thought. Someone said it's interesting to hear. Thank you. And someone's asking where the 1,000 days come from. That's a good question. I know that in particular, the American Pediatric Society really pushed this idea of the first 1,000 days, and developmental psychologists will therefore talk about the primary caregiver ideally being with the infant and then into that first part of toddlerhood a lot during that 1,000 days. And it does also come from the developing neuroscientific research, this idea that is when it is when the brain is growing and developing at a speed and a rate and in a way that happens at no other point in our lifetime. It's when the self, therefore, the emotional and social self is becoming full stop. So there's a sense that if we can get that right, if we can get the first 1,000 days right, then that capacity for self-regulation is going to be there, the capacity to soothe, the capacity to vitalize, the sense of the self in the gaze of the other is there in a solid way. And therefore, we have everything we need to go forward in life in terms of navigating trickiness. It doesn't mean that we don't suffer, but it does mean that we have the capacity for emotional regulation to manage that suffering in a way that might not then lead to something like a diagnosable mental health condition or life struggles that are so tremendously painful that perhaps could have been negated with a little bit more support a little bit earlier on. Okay, so I'm just going to wait a moment and check that there are no more questions, and I'm also just going to have a look that I didn't miss anything in the chat. Oh, and I can see, thank you, Sarah has popped some things there from Alan Shaw. And indeed, all of this will be available on the YouTube channel, so you can go back and pause any slides that you're particularly interested in and have a look. Okay, someone here said this was interesting and thanking me. Thank you for being here. Just wondering if there is much literature that explores attachments in infants with disabilities, such as visual hearing impairments, and how these children form attachments without being able to use eye gaze and tone of voice. Thank you so much for bringing that up. It's something that I've been thinking a lot about fairly recently. Again, I don't think there's a huge body of research. If you find any, please let us know, because I'd love to come across it. From what we do know, it would seem to be the case that as human beings, we'll find other ways. Remember, it's a body-to-body experience. It's a somatic experience, that emergent sense of self. So if we don't have the visual through the eye gaze, then that will be perhaps through touch. It will be the touch of the other and the connecting through the touch, which reminds me actually of a beautiful video I saw many, many years ago made by Sense, the charity that work with people who can neither see nor hear. And it was talking about the whole world in a glass of water, the way the whole world is experienced through putting the hand into the glass of water and feeling the water with one's hands. Well, for infants who cannot see and hear, both and or one or the other, touch might take that central place. Similarly, for infants that cannot see, it might be the hearing, it might be particularly the prosody and the tone of the voice that dance, that attunement and that attachment dance happens. And that's all still right brain to right brain. It's all still emotional self to emotional self. It's still beyond the world of cognitions and words and the meanings of words. That's what we're talking about here, and that can happen in a myriad of different ways through the felt sense of the body. It's a wonderful question, thank you. So I'm hoping that was interesting. It would be lovely perhaps to come back at another point and do some thinking about the corpus callosum and how the communication happens between left and right, and how we can facilitate that as practitioners, but also as parents and caregivers. And very lastly, keep having questions popping in. I'm saying goodbye and another one, last one. Someone wondering here about premature infants having to spend some weeks in hospital. And yes, I'm sure that does throw up its difficulties, and also can be not facilitatory to some of these processes that we're talking about. And yet I would say we've got 1,000 days there. Ideally, it would be every day of those 1,000 days that infant is with their primary caregiver, and they're having that felt body to body and that right brain to right brain connection. But if part of that period of time isn't possible, then I guess there's something to be said for making up for lost time. And maybe then there's a real focus on the cuddles, on the touching, on the tone of voice, on spending the time together when it is possible, and making the most of those times when it is possible. And I'm so glad that we've moved on so much in that, if children are born prematurely or very poorly, that as much as possible they try and facilitate the primary caregiver being able to have that touch and have that connection. I'm very glad. I was in with Lawrence for a few days, and I was very glad that he wasn't taken away as he would have been not so long ago, at night, for example, and then I would go and visit him. No, he was with me the whole time. He was with me the whole time, and that was incredibly precious, and I'm very, very grateful for that. So thank you for your questions, thank you for your presence, and I look forward to connecting with you hopefully on a future session. Wishing you a lovely rest of your day and evening. Goodbye.